Jean and Maggie, Part 2. Nobody saw it coming. On January 8th, 1950, after chores were done, Walter took Maggie and Leland to stay with her parents in Greenfield, 12 miles north. They were much closer to the doctor who was treating her ongoing flu symptoms. Living this far out in the country like they did, in this kind of weather, she was lucky to see him once a month. Now his house calls could be made several times a week. Her little sister had married the year before and moved to Missouri to join her husband on his family's large farm, leaving Maggie, the only daughter, still close enough for Anna and Peter to fuss over. They didn't mind. A month later, although still bitter cold, February was a little better for travel. With Maggie feeling stronger, Walt started coming for Sunday dinner. He stayed well into the evening when he visited, but never overnight. He had to get back to the farm. On February 5th, they celebrated Walt's 36th birthday with warm bread pudding and homemade whipped cream that Leland said looked like snow. 2 weeks later, after dinner on a clear, cold February Sunday, under a piercing blue sky, Maggie climbed into the truck beside Walter and headed home, leaving Leland with her parents. She was glad for the week-long respite, back in her own house. Maggie was still on the mend, and although she and Walter slept in the same bed, they touched each other only one time that week. On Sunday, February 26th, right after church, Walter returned Maggie to her parents' home. Leland's grandparents were from Denmark. He called them Mormor and Orpha. I always figured Orpha was just the best a 3-year-old little boy could do with Morfar, and the name stuck. Staying with them was the highlight of his young life. They knew how to spoil a little boy. When Walter and Maggie stepped through the door, Leland came running, his little arms outstretched as he threw himself into his mama's legs. "Mama, Daddy," he cried, his face lighting up like the sun. Maggie bent down, scooping him up with an ease that surprised her after all she'd been through. It was a moment of unexpected joy, the simple happiness they all had been longing for. Peter and Anna stood nearby, watching their daughter and her family. Peter clapped Walter on the shoulder. "Good to see you both," he said, his voice steady but warm. "Maggie, you're looking better already." Anna wiped her hands on her apron, then pressed it to her eyes, shimmering with happy tears. "Let's have a little toast before dinner," she said, ushering them all toward the sitting room. Anna had set out a plate of delicate almond wreath cookies, just like her own Mormor used to make, and 4 glasses of peach schnapps on the family's oak sideboard that held her best china and linens. The warm glow of the polished wood added a touch of elegance to the modest gathering as the Jensens prepared to toast their daughter's improving health. Leland reached for a cookie, but his Mormor gently tapped his hand. "Not yet, little one," she said with a smile. Peter raised his glass, his voice filled with gratitude and hope. "To Maggie," he said, glancing around the room, "for health, for strength, and for brighter days ahead." "Skål," they all echoed, lifting their glasses in unison in the tradition of their Danish ancestors. Maggie's smile was small but genuine as she sipped the sweet schnapps, the warmth spreading through her chest. Even Leland was handed a tiny glass, filled with apple juice instead. He clinked it against his parents' glasses, giggling as the grown-ups laughed. It was at gatherings like this one that Walter learned to appreciate the taste and delightful warming effect of peach schnapps. His in-laws called it hygge, comfort, contentment, and well-being, enjoying the simple pleasures of life with loved ones, held in a tiny crystal glass in the palm of his hand. His father-in-law, born in Denmark, understood wet, windy, bone-chilling cold weather and how to survive it with a smile on his face. Peter was 17 in 1907, not yet a man when he emigrated to America, but his father had taught him well. Walter couldn't think of a better way to spend a blustery, cold February Sunday. The melt-in-your-mouth almond cookies that Anna's grandmother taught her to make were pillars of heaven that promised better days to come. It was a simple moment that felt profound, a shared hope for healing and a future filled with many more of these happy gatherings to come. Laughter and chatter filled the house, and for a little while the worries of the adults melted away in the glow of a little boy's happiness to be with his mama and daddy. Dinner that evening was simple and delicious. Meatballs and rich brown gravy served over mashed potatoes with red cabbage, corn, and homemade rolls. Everyone around the table was happy to see Maggie's appetite return in force, and she was more than happy to clean her plate. It'd been so long since she felt good, it took her by surprise. The last time she'd had this much fun in the state of Iowa was the night she challenged Walter to leave his fiddle on stage and come dance with her. When Walter left to go back to their farm later that evening, Maggie was sorry to see him go, sorry to see the night end. They didn't get many like this one. Her husband was a quiet, steady man who took days to mull over something she could decide in minutes. It could be maddening to wait for the wheels in his head to turn toward an answer. Spontaneity was never a problem for Walter. He didn't believe in it. They couldn't be more opposite. But it was his steady ways and never-ending determination to make her better that had gotten her this far. Still, as she lay in bed that night, listening to the wind rattle the windows, an old ache stirred inside her, a restlessness she couldn't quite name. It was nothing, just the quiet, just the winter, just the way things had always been. She loved him, and she knew he loved her, so admitting to her daily boredom on the farm was one among many other things that she would never share. She rolled over and closed her eyes. The next day, Dr. Gant stopped by with good news. He believed Maggie's illness could be cured by a new medicine, streptomycin. It worked like a miracle on several of his patients, and he thought it would work for her too. If she was willing to try it, he'd put in an order, and in about 10 days, she should be able to start getting a lot better, a lot faster. It was almost too good to believe. She'd been sick long enough to wonder if she'd ever feel good again. Seeing a light at the end of that dark tunnel felt like a miracle, even before she got the medicine. After such a happy reunion the day before, and now this good news, Maggie could feel her body responding, getting stronger already. Almost good enough to go into town with her parents and Leland the next day. Tuesday was their shopping day, and little Leland had become accustomed to being even more spoiled than usual. That trip always meant a few extra pieces of candy from the general store and lunch at the diner, where his favorite waitress gave him a piece of pie with ice cream on top. Tuesday was his favorite day. Maggie almost went along, but when she woke up, as good as she was feeling after the doctor's visit, she knew it would be best to stay home. Leland left with his Mormor and Orpha right after breakfast. It was a cold day, so Maggie bundled him up right through his complaints. When he was finally ready to go, the clock struck 9 a.m., and Maggie was feeling winded. She was glad to see the door close and the house go silent when the trio finally headed out. Living with her parents on their farm wasn't as quiet as life on the farm with Walter, and she was glad for it. They were much closer to town, just a quarter-mile from the school. Kids walking down the road with their books tied in a bundle, and the mailman making his rounds as her father's farmhands worked in the barn was background noise that she enjoyed and often missed when she was so far away from civilization. Maggie was lost in her thoughts, sitting at the kitchen table drinking a second cup of coffee, when a strong knock came at the back door. Looking in the direction of the sound, she saw the shadow of a large man through the lace curtain that covered 9 window panes. Her heart began to pound. There was only one person she knew who stood at that massive height. She hadn't seen him in 4 years, but right now, it felt like yesterday. Maggie's head was spinning, but not for the reason the doctor would expect. There was only one time when her boredom on the farm had been lifted, and she was sure that reason was standing at the back door right now. Taking a deep breath and draining her coffee cup, she wiped her hands on her apron, walked through the kitchen, and made her way toward the scullery. The room felt colder without Mama here. The faint scent of lye soap lingered near the sink, and the late winter sunlight slanted through the big windows, highlighting the neat rows of canned vegetables that were tucked onto the shelves. Maggie's footsteps on the wood floor seemed louder than they should have been, echoing off the walls. Her fingers brushed the edge of the counter as she passed, a small grounding gesture she wasn't even aware of. The knock came again, firmer this time, as if the visitor was growing impatient. Maggie swallowed, the quiet house around her suddenly feeling too big and way too empty. When she reached the door, her hand hesitated on the knob. If she had any doubts about who stood on the other side, they all disappeared. Maggie knew her parents didn't receive visitors on a Tuesday, not when the whole town knew they'd be gone. She pulled the door open, and there he was, Gene Smith. The sight of him hit her harder than the gust of winter wind that came through the door behind him. His easy smile carried a mix of mischief and charm. "Morning, Maggie," he drawled, his voice as familiar as it was unexpected. Maggie's breath hitched, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. She gripped the doorknob tighter, her voice coming out softer than she meant. "Gene, what are you doing here?" Her surprise was clear, but so was the spark of something else, something she'd leave buried for now. Gene told her he had stopped by to see Darryl, but she didn't believe him. It felt like part of a plan, showing up in the middle of the morning while her parents and Leland were in town all day. Besides, Darryl worked at the farm co-op and supply. Gene knew that. He wasn't fooling her none. Gene was good at showing up when he wasn't expected, but never without a reason. Gene had quit the co-op a few months earlier to start driving a delivery truck and work part-time with his stepfather in Grinnell. A visit to Greenfield in the middle of a Tuesday morning was unusual. Maggie knew that. But what she didn't know was that Darryl had told Gene she was still sick. He felt like he had to come see her again. Seeing him standing there like no time had passed at all, her chest tightened, like she'd been caught unawares by a strong wind. "Darryl ain't here," she said, glancing toward the road behind the house. Gene shrugged. "Don't matter much. Just passing through. Didn't really figure I'd run into anybody anyway. Just thought I'd see how you're doing before I get gone. Don't you ever get tired of all the quiet around here?" He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes lingering on hers. When she didn't answer, he just said, "Been a while, Maggie." It had been more than 4 years since that September when they'd stolen moments together that neither of them ever spoke of again. They'd seen each other in passing a few times, but since Darryl moved to town, that was rare. To see each other in private like this never happened. But now, here he was, looking at her the way Walter hadn't in a long time. That look brought back a flood of memories, feelings she thought she'd forgotten. Once, Walter had looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, back in Florida, back when their love came easy. Now, all she saw in him was weariness. She told herself it didn't matter, but here Gene was, looking at her like she was something worth wanting. And suddenly, she wasn't so sure. Walter was a good man who worked hard to take care of her and Leland. But standing there, looking at Gene, she realized it wasn't enough. Her breath caught at the thought, shame rising in her throat. She wanted to be faithful to her husband, to honor the vows she'd made, but she couldn't ignore the truth clawing its way to the surface. She still loved Walt, but somewhere along the way things had changed. She thought of their time in Florida when it felt like they'd be lovers in love forever, no matter what happened. The realization of how much had changed hit her like a blow, leaving her dizzy and unsteady. And Gene was different. He wasn't just Darryl's best friend anymore. He was a man she'd thought of more often than she cared to admit, a man who looked at her with desire, something she hadn't seen in years. She felt her heart ache, torn between loyalty to a marriage that felt like an obligation and the overwhelming pull of a love she hadn't meant to feel. Maggie hesitated, thinking about how empty the house was and how long it'd be before her parents returned. Her fingers flexed on the doorframe. The house was empty. Walt was away, and Jean was standing right in front of her, waiting. The words came before she could stop them. "You want some coffee?" she asked, her voice soft. He smiled and stepped inside. Jean would visit Maggie 2 more times, knocking at the scullery door when she'd have the whole day ahead of her, all alone, except for him. He always left right before the house filled up with the happy sounds of her 3-year-old son and her mama and daddy's updates of people they'd seen and gossip they'd heard. Maggie stood at the back door every time he left, watching him take long strides toward his truck parked under the oak tree near the road. He never hurried, never glanced over his shoulder, just walked like he belonged there. She remembered him once saying the best way to get away with something you shouldn't be doing was to do it right out in the open. Act like you're right where you're supposed to be. And Lord help her, it was working. When he opened the driver's door and bent his powerful frame to get in, she caught her breath. How could this be the same bratty little kid her little brother dragged around like a stray pup? On that last Tuesday, Maggie was hurting. She knew it would be their last time together like this, but the ache ran deeper than that. The streptomycin injections she received near daily made her arms sore with fever, aching straight to the bone. She was getting better, she could feel it, but on that day, getting better felt a whole lot more like feeling worse. Most of that last morning was spent recalling their childhood innocence, like they both knew this would be their last time to talk about it. At 7 years old, Jean had to grow up fast when his daddy walked out and set up housekeeping down the street with Jeanette. His mama had to stand on their own with 4 kids to raise and another one on the way in a town that blamed her for what her man did. It left a mark on Jean, one he'd never be able to erase. Maggie was 17 years old when her 5-year-old brother Darryl started bringing Jean to their grandparents' house in Grinnell. Darryl and Maggie spent a good part of every summer in Grinnell. Her grandparents needed Maggie's help now that they were getting older, and adding another kid to the mix came easy for her. Darryl needed something to do, and Jean was the perfect answer. He was like family by this time anyway. After her high school graduation in 1938, Maggie moved in with her grandparents and enrolled in an intensive business course at Grinnell College. A year later, she was back home, keeping ledgers and balancing accounts for Greenfield Farm Co-op and Supply. Jean was her little brother's ornery best friend, the kid who helped Darryl get into more than his fair share of trouble. 12 years later, that ornery little boy was a full-grown man. And now, here they were. When Jean said goodbye to Maggie that afternoon, they both felt it. Their love affair was over. He walked through the scullery and out the back door, knowing whatever they had found together in these stolen moments was already in the past, gone forever. Maggie set her jaw, determined to put Jean and their affair out of her mind, to erase it like it had never happened. Ever kiss, ever embrace, ever whispered desire, just a dream that never was. She knew other women who had done the same, especially after the war ended. It could be done, and she'd be one to do it. Maggie continued to get better, and once the doctor trained Walter to give her shots, there was no reason for her to stay away from the farm. By the time Easter came in early April, she and Leland were back home again. With her fever gone and her appetite back with a vengeance, she was glad to be sleeping in her own bed and cooking in her own kitchen. Maggie had decided to put Jean out of her mind as best she could. She celebrated the holiday with Leland, watching him run through the yard looking for eggs, his laughter echoing through the spring air. She told herself this was enough, her family, her home, and her son. She had so effectively erased Jean from her mind that she hardly noticed when she missed her monthly cycle in March, then again in April. Pregnancy wasn't at the forefront of her thoughts. The one time the idea crossed her mind, she brushed it off as just another way her body was still finding its balance. Besides, her cycle had been hit or miss for more than a year now. Everything felt a little off-kilter these days. Crocus peeked out of the snow that still lay around their wraparound porch as life finally went back to normal. But as the days passed, Maggie was forced to acknowledge the change in her body. Her appetite went from ravenous to practically non-existent. The only thing she could keep down was Kartoffelsuppe, her mama's recipe for potato soup. She was exhausted, but this was different, not like her winter sickness, and she knew what it was. The doctor had given him enough streptomycin to last 2 weeks. As the third week approached, Maggie made plans to go into town with Leland. She'd see the doctor and take her son out to lunch. Walter wouldn't join him this time. Maggie told the doctor she suspected she was pregnant. By the end of the appointment, he confirmed her suspicions with a look of concern in his eyes. "Maggie, streptomycin is going to save your life, but it could make some trouble for your baby. Based on my calculations, we'll need to end your injections sooner than I'd hoped. You keep coming in each week for now, but in May, we'll taper you down to 2 injections a week. By the end of that month, we need to stop." She left the office with her weekly dose in hand, determined not to think about how, since the start of the new year, things seemed to jump right out of nowhere to grab her by the ankle and sink in their teeth. She felt like she ought to be limping by now, but here she was, walking tall and straight like everything was fine. Leaving the doctor's office, she took Leland's hand. "What do you say we go get ourselves some lunch and top it off with a piece of pie and ice cream?" The smile on her little boy's face gave her the answer she wanted. Turning right to head down the sidewalk to the diner, she was nearly knocked to the ground when she ran straight into the chest of Gene Smith. It'd been 6 weeks. When they ran into each other, Gene catching sight of Leland for the first time ever made her heart seize in her chest. Gene didn't say much, not with other folks nearby, but the look in his eyes said plenty. Maggie saw him studying Leland, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable, until he finally looked at her. That's when she saw it, the recognition, the truth she'd been trying to ignore ever since she held Leland for the first time. She hadn't wanted to see it then, and she didn't want to see it now. But there it was, plain as day. From the other side of the street, someone called Gene's name, and just like that, he was gone. A few weeks later, after a trip to town with Leland, Maggie stopped to check in on her parents. Daryl and Gene were already there. "For all these years we barely see each other. Now it feels like every time I take a step, you're there to meet me," she thought. An hour later, when she walked out to the car with Leland to leave, Gene followed. She knew why. "Is he mine?" Gene whispered as he opened the door for her. Maggie hesitated, her hands holding tight to the top of the car door as Leland climbed into the back seat, already making plans to plow up the back 40 with his toy tractor. Her papa was in the barn, but she could feel her mother watching from the scullery door. Nobody talked about their secrets here in Iowa, but sometimes you could see 'em on their faces. Her mama was like that. She always knew. There was no use lying to the man. "Yes," Maggie said, her voice steady even though her insides felt like they were unraveling. "Leland is your son." Gene nodded, his face hard to read, but the weight of her words settled heavy in the air between them. Then she told him the rest, her words spilling out before she could stop. "I think this new baby is yours too." What she didn't say, what she never said out loud to anyone, was that she wasn't sure Walter could give her children at all. They'd been married 5 years, living in Florida like lovers without a care. The babies didn't start coming till she came home to Iowa, till she found Gene again. The silence that followed felt endless, like the whole world was holding its breath. Finally, Gene sighed, his shoulders slumping just enough to make him look like the boy he used to be. "I can't do it, Maggie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't be what you need, what they need, not now." Maggie wanted to scream at him, to tell him that she hadn't asked him for anything, that she didn't need him to fix what couldn't be fixed. But she just nodded, feeling the ache settle deeper in her chest. "I don't expect anything from you, Gene. I knew what I was doing, so did you. I'll raise our kids to believe they belong to my husband. I'll never talk about you. Don't you worry." Her eyes were filling with tears now. She hadn't thought this would be so hard. Daryl ran from the barn yelling at Jean, "We got to get to work. Let's go." Jean had come back to work at the co-op when painting in Grinnell and driving a truck didn't give him the thrills he was looking for. Besides, working with Daryl promised to be a lot more fun. As they drove away, Maggie knew this would be the last time she'd see the father of her children. He'd told her he was planning to join the army. She was sure he'd do that now. Maybe they'd send him to Europe. Maybe he'd find a way to forget about her and the children he'd left behind. Maybe that's what she needed, too. When Leland gave her a homemade Mother's Day card a few weeks later, before they left for church on a beautiful May morning, Maggie smiled down at him, her heart full of a love she couldn't deny. "You're going to have a little brother or sister before Christmas, sweetheart," she said, ruffling his hair. She knelt down beside her son and whispered in his ear, "I think it's going to be a boy." Maggie had grown up enough to know that even if her life wasn't everything she hoped it would be since the war ended and she'd made the choice to leave Florida and come back home with Walter, she had found happiness. Her son and this new baby were evidence of how love can lead you in ways you never expected. Being a mother wasn't at the top of her list as a young woman looking for fun when she lived in the tropics. But then she came back to Iowa, and nothing would ever be the same.